Hey, everybody, and welcome to our session Disability 101 with Student Accessibility Coordinator Carolyn Levine. Carolyn is celebrating like her first-ish. She's been here just a little bit more than a year with us now here at Blue Ridge, and we're really appreciative of all the expertise that she brings to the college and what she can share with us on how we can address the needs of our students and make our college more inclusive for everyone. I'm going to hand it over to Carolyn, and I'll be watching the chat. So if anybody has any questions or wants to seek out further resources or information, you're welcome to put that in the chat. Carolyn, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parlier. Again, my name is Carolyn Levine. I'm the Student Accessibility Services Coordinator here at Blue Ridge, and I have survived an entire year. Yay! So this particular presentation is called Disability 101, and the goal is to give you just a brief overview of how disability services work here at the college, and also some different types of disabilities that you might encounter. I'm not going to get into the diagnostic criteria or anything that in depth for the disability categories, but I am going to give you some pointers on how to support students who might fall into one of those respective categories and what those behaviors might look like in a classroom setting, because I felt like that would be more helpful for you as faculty. So I'm going to get started with an introduction to disability. So this is going to be the definition of disability, the applicable laws, and then we're going to get into the disability categories. These categories are not all inclusive, of course. I can't cover everything in one presentation, but these are sort of the main 8 categories that most disabilities that we see in higher education fall into. And that's ADHD, autism, hearing disabilities, learning disabilities, physical disabilities, psychological disabilities, speech and language disabilities, and visual disabilities. And then lastly, we are going to talk about disability etiquette. And again, this is something that I could go into a lot of depth with and would probably take all afternoon. So I'm going to try and keep it to the basics. Disability etiquette that you could apply in a lot of different situations. But if you do want more information about maybe specific etiquette with certain populations, please let me know. I'll be happy to share that information with you. All right, so getting started. What is a disability? So the most common definition that we look at, especially in higher education, is the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA's definition. So that's any physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. Now, the ADA does not list all the different disabilities that can qualify for accommodations and things like that. What's really important is that the impairment substantially limits some area of functioning in that person's life. And so I like to talk about impairment versus disability. So impairment, and this is according to the World Health Organization, is any loss or abnormality of psychological, physiological, or anatomical structure or function. Disability, and this is from the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is part of the UN, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. This results from the interaction between persons with impairments and the attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinders their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So what that means is someone can have an impairment, but it doesn't necessarily cause a disability. So someone could have a diagnosis and it may not cause any impairments in the educational setting. It may cause impairments in their personal life or maybe at work. It doesn't necessarily mean that it definitely will result in some kind of difficulty or deficit in a learning environment. So I think that's an important distinction to make, that just because someone has a diagnosis doesn't mean that they necessarily will qualify for certain accommodations. And that is a conversation that I have with students. It's not, oh, you have this diagnosis of ADHD, so you get this, this, and this. It doesn't work that way. It's very person specific, and the student needs to be able to articulate to me how, whatever their diagnosis is impacts them in a learning environment. Okay. I like to include a little bit of this data here from the CDC about the prevalence of disability, just because I think sometimes we think of disability as only affecting a very, very small group of people, but it actually affects a lot of people. So again, this is according to the CDC, 27% of US adults have a disability and 29% of adults in North Carolina have a disability. Now that number is probably a lot higher because again, this is just the people that responded to the survey that was sent out. I know in higher education, especially among students, I think it's only like 35% of students who would qualify for accommodations will actually register with accessibility services. So it's very likely that even if you don't have accommodation letters for students, that you will have students in your classes that have some kind of disability and may or may not have an accommodation. So it's helpful just to be aware that this could be going on with them. All right, so legal framework. Got to talk about this, of course. The Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA requires that people with disabilities not be excluded from participation or be denied benefits or subjected to discrimination. And then Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities by programs and activities receiving federal funds, which is, of course, Blue Ridge Community College. So what that means for us is that those who have qualified for admissions have a right to be in higher education, regardless of disability. And once the student is admitted, they have the right to access academic and non-academic programs. I think that's a really important thing to remember, that it's not just the classes they have a right to access, but it's the other student activities, clubs, sports, what have you. Qualified students are eligible to receive accommodations. And also students have the right to confidentiality for all disability information. So that's why when you get accommodation letters from me, there's nothing on there about diagnosis. I'm never going to share that information with anyone. And but do know that I have documentation on file for all students that are receiving accommodations. So I'm not just handing things out because I feel like it. Now, y'all will be hearing a lot more about this in the coming months, but there have been some updates to the ADA and Section 504. These updates relate to digital accessibility. So historically, Blue Ridge has done a really good job of trying to make sure that all of our content is accessible, but that hasn't been a legal requirement until now. So all community colleges, all public entities, anybody covered by Title II of the ADA, which is a lot of employers, colleges, a lot of institutions. It requires that our web content and mobile applications are accessible to people with disabilities, and specifically that we are compliant with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 AA at minimum. Again, we will get into this more in the coming months, but for instructors, this is going to mean that your PDFs need to be accessible. Well, all of your content needs to be accessible, but we see the most issues with PDFs, with alt text, having captions on videos, those kind of things. And again, this is something that Blue Ridge has done a really good job of. So I don't think anyone's going to have to start from scratch or anything like that. It's just going to be, you know, crossing our T's and dotting our I's and making sure every piece of content is accessible. All right, I want to talk a little bit about accommodations and accessibility. So accommodations are adjustments or modifications that provide equal access to learning. What's really important to know about accommodations is that they are meant to level the playing field. They are not meant to give students an unfair advantage, and they do not guarantee success, which is a big departure from accommodations in K-12. That's a totally different legal framework. That's under IDEA, which does guarantee success. The ADA does not guarantee success, it guarantees access. So again, we're looking at each individual disability and the functional impact of that disability for each student. So it's case by case and class by class. There might be accommodations that are not applicable in certain classes. So when would that happen? That could happen when providing said accommodation would result in a fundamental alteration to the service, program, or activity. And the example that I've chosen is the accommodation, please allow student to present one-on-one to the instructor versus the entire class. This would not apply to most assignments in a class like public speaking, where that is, you know, an essential requirement of the class and of that program is to speak in front of others, not just one person. Now, this might apply in a class, let's say, like a history class or an English class, where the student is being graded more on content versus their actual public speaking skills. So if you ever have a question, if you're not sure if an accommodation applies to your class, please, please, please ask me. I'm always happy to help with that. It can be confusing, and, you know, I don't know exactly how every class is set up. So when you get accommodation letters from me, I'm sending you everything that the student has been approved for. And it's really up to you to decide if it's appropriate for your class or not. But again, before you ever tell a student no, please talk to me first. All right, so moving on to accessibility. I like to talk about the difference between access and accessibility. These two terms are not interchangeable. Access refers to the opportunity or the right to do something, and accessibility refers to the design of products, services, environments, so that they are usable by persons with or without disabilities. So what's important to remember is that sometimes access is ensured, but accessibility is not. So for example, a student might have access to documents in a printed or digital form, but if the documents are not accessible, they are unavailable in the format the student requires. So like, let's say the student is blind and they need them to be screen reader accessible. Well, they might be able to access them, like in my courses or in an in-person class, maybe it's a physical handout, but if they can't read them or absorb them with a screen reader, then they're not really accessible. Any questions so far?
I'm not seeing anything in the chat.
All right, then we will move along to disability categories. So again, this does not cover every single disability that exists. Again, these are the more commonly seen disabilities in higher education. So I'm going to start with ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which I think most people are probably familiar with. This often manifests as students having trouble staying organized. They have trouble following through on tasks, so not completing assignments, missing deadlines, missing parts of lecture because, you know, they're get distracted by something. They might be fidgety or disruptive in class. Probably don't see this as much in higher education as you would maybe in K-12, but it could still happen. So consequences of that, if they're frequently distracted during lecture, they might miss key information. They have trouble managing their time and submitting assignments on time. This is probably what I see the most, is this trouble with time management. And that is something that there's not really an accommodation for. It's really more of just working with them on that executive functioning and how to manage their time and working on those coping strategies. They might struggle to stay focused and organized, also in group work as well as independent work. So some things you can do to help is to break tasks down into smaller, manageable steps with clear deadlines. So if you can give deadlines as far in advance as possible, that's really helpful. If it's an in-person seated class, providing frequent breaks and allowing movement during class if possible. So of course, we don't want students to be disrupting other students, but you know, maybe if they are discreet and just need to stand up for a minute, they're still paying attention and listening, but you know, sometimes that physical movement can help with that focus. Encouraging them to use organizational tools like planners, digital reminders, to help them manage their time and stay up to date on those assignments. Autism spectrum disorder. All right, so when we talk about a spectrum disorder, most people think of autism, but pretty much any disability you could describe as being on a spectrum. But autism, I think, is the most obvious example, and we see that a lot with that social communication and their ability to participate in work or class discussions. They might be really sensitive to sensory input like bright lights, loud noises, which can make the classroom environment overwhelming. They may have really intense focus on specific interests and struggle to switch subjects or move from task to task that, you know, don't align with their specific interests. So if you have a student like that, it's okay to redirect them and to be very direct in your communication. I've done several presentations about supporting students on the spectrum in post-secondary environments. They are on my SAS page on the Insider, so feel free to check those out if you want more information. But again, don't be afraid to be direct and just say, hey, you know, thank you for sharing, but we need to move on and talk about XYZ, whatever it is you were talking about in the class.
Hey, Carolyn,
Yeah.
can I mention too that our professional learning catalog from last year has some of your presentations that you did for Blue Ridge as well. So if they want to watch those recorded sessions, we have those in our YouTube channel.
Oh, sweet. Also
Yep.
check out the YouTube channel. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. So some things you can do that would be helpful to support students. on the spectrum would be to provide clear, concise instructions, structured routines, again, giving notice about due dates as far in advance as possible. Sometimes it might feel like overkill when you're giving very concise instructions, but I think it's helpful for everyone, really. It's if you assume that people know stuff, that always tends to backfire, which I'm sure you all know. Visual aids and written communication is really, really helpful. So if you rely solely on verbal instructions, that can be really hard for folks on the spectrum, not just folks on the spectrum, but it can be hard for our folks with ADHD, anxiety, and other diagnoses. So providing everything in writing is really helpful so the student can go back and refer to it. It may take them a little longer to process certain parts of the instruction. And so if they have it in writing, they can take that time after class to go back and reread it and process that information. Also allowing alternative ways of participation, such as written responses instead of oral discussions, sensory-friendly spaces when possible. Again, with the alternative ways of participating in class, you don't have to fundamentally alter your class. So if part of the class is working on oral presentation skills, then you don't have to waive that requirement for them. But if maybe that's not a key factor of the class or not a core objective, then offering those alternative ways to participate is really helpful. All right, hearing disabilities. So students that might be deaf or hard of hearing. I think the impact on learning is pretty obvious for this group. Group discussion, fast-paced dialogue can be difficult to follow. They might have trouble hearing lectures, class discussion, anything with audio can be difficult to follow along with. They might miss information. A student, they might miss important details, especially if you only give instructions or information verbally. And of course, participating in group work can be challenging if it involves a lot of verbal communication. So to support those students, and again, you guys have done a really great job of doing this already, but including captions on all of your videos. If a student needs a sign language interpreter, that is something that faculty is not responsible for coordinating. That is something that my office handles. However, students do need to contact me so that I am aware that they need an interpreter and when, but I take care of all of that scheduling and setting up those services. Offering written transcripts for audio and videos is really helpful. Again, like I mentioned with folks on the spectrum, having that written copy of instructions and information is very helpful. Visual aids to complement that verbal instruction, super helpful. You guys might be noticing a theme with these support strategies. All right, moving on to learning disabilities. So the examples I've given are dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. These are not all of the learning disabilities that exist. These are just some of the more common, well-known learning disabilities. So someone with dyslexia will have difficulty with reading, decoding words, comprehending written text. So of course, that's going to make it hard for them to follow reading assignments, and they might take a longer amount of time to absorb large amounts of written information. Dysgraphia, this is when folks have difficulties with handwriting, spelling, and organizing written thoughts, which naturally is going to affect their writing assignments and note-taking ability. And then dyscalculia is specific to numbers and math concepts. So anything math related is going to be difficult for them. Again, so a student with dyslexia is going to have a hard time reading aloud, or they might misinterpret written instructions. A student with dysgraphia is going to struggle to write legibly or form coherent essays. And a student with dyscalculia is going to have trouble in general with math classes or anything involving numbers. So what's helpful for all of these groups is to use text-to-speech software. So that means that their text is read aloud to them. So they're reading along as they're listening to it. I know at home, I even watch TV with the captions on. That's really helpful for me. It's amazing how much we miss sometimes when we're just listening. Also using speech-to-text tools for typing instead of handwriting for students with dysgraphia. That's also helpful for folks with dyslexia, where they can, they know what they want to say, but it's difficult for them to spell words and maybe write it in a coherent fashion. It's a lot easier for them to say it out loud. Another helpful strategy is to provide extra practice visual aids. It's very helpful, especially with understanding math concepts for students with dyscalculia. Right, physical disabilities. So this is things like cerebral palsy, spinal cord injuries, anything that would have someone using a wheelchair. This is probably one of the only disabilities that you can see, like it's very obvious when you meet the student that they do have a physical disability. That being said, I would say probably more than 90% of the students registered with my office have an invisible disability. So that's a disability that you cannot see, and you really only get an idea that they might have something going on when you start seeing their work and the difficulty with assignments and things like that. So folks with physical disabilities, again, the mobility piece I think is pretty obvious, but this can also affect fine motor skills, which can affect their note-taking, writing, or using standard classroom equipment, especially lab equipment. If they don't have those fine motor skills, it could be hard, let's say like in a chemistry or biology lab, to be able to measure out different solutions and, hold those glass beakers. And there's a lot of little things that you need to have a lot of fine motor skills to do. So they might need assistance to participate in lab-based activities. Having note-taking assistance is really helpful. My office has software that students can use if this is something that they're struggling with. And then there's also some free apps out there that they can use. It's really up to the student. But if you have a student that's struggling with this, please let me know. Again, I don't think anyone's had any issues with making their classroom physically accessible. Y'all have done a great job with that. But if you do have a student that maybe struggles with the more physical tasks, having virtual labs or modified equipment is a great way to help them to be able to still participate and get the information while still meeting the criteria of the class. All right, psychological disabilities. This is where I would say probably the majority of students registered with my office fall. So this is things like anxiety, depression, PTSD. I also included selective mutism on here. I have not seen this come across my desk at Blue Ridge, but I have seen it in higher education in the past, and it's a very tricky one. And it's a little counterintuitive that it's a psychological disability, but it's actually a form of anxiety. So students with psychological disabilities usually have hard time concentrating, participating in class. They get easily overwhelmed, and so following through on assignments is difficult because they might get so hung up on one piece of it or wanting it to be perfect, and so they spend a lot of time on it, don't finish it on time. Stressful situations, that are stressful for anyone, like exams, presentations, group work, can be especially stressful for folks with these kind of diagnoses, which will lead to avoidance, withdrawal. You might notice that they are not attending class on presentation day or on group work day. That's not always a coincidence. Focusing on schoolwork and keeping their motivation up is also a big struggle. So allowing for flexibility and participation is really helpful, again, as long as it's not fundamentally altering the requirements of your class. If you can provide extended deadlines or breaks during exams, that's great. Offering emotional support resources, referring them to my office, to our counseling office, to the student support group or my group that all students have access to. Just letting them know that there are people here to support them if they need that extra support, and don't feel like that should fall on you to provide that extra support. But it is helpful if you can at least refer them to folks who can provide that. All right, speech and language disabilities. So some of these are more obvious than others. So stuttering, I think everyone is very well aware of what that is. But things like aphasia are not always as obvious. So aphasia is when someone has difficulty articulating, like they know what they want to say, but maybe they can't think of the specific word. And you'll see them get frustrated a lot, especially if they're called on to answer questions. It might take them longer to respond. You might see more of that avoidance behavior, especially when it comes to oral presentations or speaking in class. So again, the allowing flexibility and participation is helpful. These support strategies are very similar to what you saw for the psychological disabilities. And they can get really discouraged as well. So again, focusing on those emotional support resources, making sure folks are aware of what is available to them and that there are folks here to support them if needed. All right, visual disabilities. So this is blindness, low vision. This is another one where the spectrum is very wide, and just because someone may technically meet the diagnostic criteria for blindness, that doesn't mean that they have no vision at all. So they may not need accommodation. So sometimes, like, for example, if someone is only lost vision in one eye, but the other eye they have 20/20 vision, that's going to affect their depth perception, not so much their ability to read text on a screen or on a piece of paper. But if it does affect their reading abilities, having a screen reader is really helpful. Being able to sit close to the front of the class is helpful. So providing materials in accessible formats is crucial. That might be larger print or digitally so that they can use a screen reader. We don't see the Braille as much anymore, but if you ever do get a request for Braille, again, that's something my office would handle. You would not be responsible for that, so just let me know. If they need assistive technology, magnification devices, again, screen readers, let me know. I can help with that. And then making sure that you have alt text on all of your images, and when you're presenting information, that you're describing all of that visual content out loud. All right. I feel like I flew through those pretty fast. So any questions about any of those?
I have a question, Carolyn, about contrast and color.
Mhm.
And of course, I know there's just some extremes as far as the white on black is the best contrast, but as far as the the area, no pun intended, but the gray area, where are you? What's really the best practices for applying contrast?
That is an excellent question. Like you said, the black and white is the preferred. Obviously, that shows the most contrast. But we want to make our material visually interesting to students, and there's nothing wrong with that. So don't feel like you have to make everything very plain and black and white. It's okay to use colors. But I think just making sure, like if you're looking at a color wheel, for example, I think this is one of the easiest ways. You look at a color wheel and you see one color here and then one color that's on the opposite side. Make sure that they're at the very least, on opposite sides of the color wheel, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Try to avoid reds and yellows, though. Those are really hard, just in general.
I actually just looked up the WCAG 2.1 AA standard and put it in the chat because I read it yesterday, and so I knew it was there, and it's a very clear like contrast ratio. So that's the kind of thing that Jamie and Wes and I will be looking at. And we've already run across, color contrast issues. Ally will check it in the LMS a little bit, but I know that something like Jean Metzger, our webmaster, she's really on top of that standard as well, of like what does it need to look like. So it's a great question.
It is, yes. And I think, most of us can subjectively tell if something has good contrast or not. So I would say, use professional judgment, and when in doubt, ask Jamie, ask Sarah, ask me. But yeah, y'all have done a really good job with that, at least from what I've seen. So kudos.
Thank you. Yeah, I use that. I put a link in the chat for something that I use that it's not, I'd like to hear your thoughts on it at some point, but it's kind of it's a contrast checker that you can sort of apply different backgrounds to different color text, and it kind of gives you a pass or fail based on, but so that's a good resource.
Ooh, yeah, I like that. I'll definitely check that out. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Any other questions? That was a good one. All right. So moving on to disability etiquette. Again, this is going to be general disability etiquette that you could apply to a lot of different groups of folks. But if you want some more specific etiquette for specific populations, please let me know. That information is out there. So in general, ask before offering to help. So we don't want to just assume that people with disabilities aren't capable of managing their day-to-day activities independently, and they may not require assistance. Even if you are well-intentioned, that can still come off as you not respecting their autonomy, or assuming that they can't do something that they can actually do. The next one is speaking directly to the person. So if someone has an interpreter, for example, and then I know this is difficult because I think our knee-jerk reaction is to look at the person who is speaking, which is very normal. But in that situation, the interpreter is supposed to be almost like an extension of the person that they are interpreting for. So you want to look at the person, the student, and not the interpreter. Respecting personal space and equipment. So things like wheelchairs, canes, hearing aids, other assistive devices, that think about that as an extension of the person as well. So don't lean on wheelchairs or touch them without permission. Don't move mobility aids or devices unless you are asked to, of course. And if you're having a conversation with someone in a wheelchair, try to sit at eye level to make communication more comfortable. I think that's just good, interpersonal communication skills. All right, this is a big one. Again, as I said earlier, most of the students that are registered with my office have an invisible disability. So you aren't going to know what they have going on. You might know that they have accommodations, but it's also very possible that they didn't know they could register for accommodations or they didn't want to. It could be a lot of different reasons, but they could still have this going on and no one really be aware. So we want to avoid making assumptions about someone's abilities, respect their privacy, and it is up to them if they want to disclose a disability. We don't want to push for anything like that. We want to be, again, cognizant of their right to confidentiality and privacy. The next one is using appropriate terminology. I don't think anyone at Blue Ridge has an issue with this one, but I feel like it needs to be said just in case. Don't use terms like crippled, handicapped, suffering from, confined to. As you well know, these terms carry a lot of negative connotations, and we want to focus on using person first or identity first language. If you don't understand something, ask for clarification rather than pretending you understand. So if someone that has a stutter or aphasia, give them a minute. Or folks sometimes with cerebral palsy, it might take them a little longer to answer questions, or their speech might be a little hard to understand. It's okay to ask them to repeat themselves. It's better that you do that than just being like, oh yeah, I heard you, I understood, we're good. And then you guys are on completely different pages. For folks that are deaf or hard of hearing, they're reading your lips, speak clearly at a normal volume, make sure you have their attention before you start talking, and make sure that you are facing them. So when you're giving lectures, try to make sure you're facing the class the entire time and you're not talking while your back is to the class. So again, this is very similar to previous slides, but I feel like it cannot be said enough. Don't assume what a person can or cannot do based on their disability. Some students are going to be very open with you about their disability, and that's great. That's their prerogative. But again, we all have our own biases about different diagnoses and what that looks like. So just keep in mind that an autism diagnosis is going to look very different for one person versus another. And that's true for any diagnosis. So we want to treat people like individuals and let them show us what their abilities and limitations are. Being respectful of service animals. So remember, service animals are working, they are not pets. We don't need to be petting them, feeding them, distracting them. Make sure you ask the owner's permission before you pet the animal. This is probably something you'll have to remind students of. Service animals aren't required to wear a service animal vest. A lot of times they do, and it should be pretty obvious that they're a service animal. You can usually tell by how they're behaved. Their attention is usually focused solely on the student or the individual that they're with. But on Blue Ridge's campus, it's important to know, we are not required to allow students to have emotional support animals. We are only required to allow service animals. And according to the ADA, a service animal is a dog or a miniature horse. I've never seen someone that had a miniature horse as a service animal, but apparently some people somewhere do. So if a student tells you that they have a service cat or a service iguana, no, they don't, and no, they do not have the right to bring it to class. Students also technically don't have to have an accommodation letter to bring a service animal on campus. Most of the time they'll register with my office anyway, and you'll get a letter that says the student has a service animal. But just keep that in mind that they may or may not register with my office if that's the only accommodation that they need. Also, if for some reason the animal is not behaving, like if it's running around the class, barking, being distracting, please let me know, because that is not something that we allow. The animal does have to be in control. They have to be housebroken, those kind of things. All right. So moving on, number 9, maintaining a positive and inclusive attitude. Again, we want to focus on abilities, not disabilities and limitations. Avoid being patronizing or, coming off as that you pity the person. People with disabilities wanted to be treated like everyone else. And then the last one is to respect personal boundaries. Again, some students are going to tell you their entire life story, but others may not. They may not want to tell you anything. So don't push them to answer those kind of questions. Please don't ever ask a student what their disability is. That is illegal. Please don't ever do that. And also, we don't want to treat a disability like it's the defining aspect of that person's identity. It's just one part of who they are. So when you're talking to them, ask them questions you would ask anybody else. What are their hobbies? What are their interests? What do they want to do after they leave Blue Ridge? Again, treating them like everyone else. So any questions about those before we get into inclusive language guidelines?
Yeah, I have a question, Carolyn. This is Sarah. Can we go back for just a second to that last point you were making about not asking?
Yeah.
So I know that we absolutely need to respect personal boundaries and follow the law, but a lot of instructors come across students who we feel may have a need for accommodation, and that can be really tricky. Like, how do we support a student getting an accommodation if we're not allowed to ask? So can you give us some advice there?
Excellent. That is a really good question. So obviously, we don't want to make assumptions and just assume, oh, you're struggling because you have a disability. But what you can ask about is, very objective behaviors or work samples that you've seen. So if you've seen in your class that a student is having a hard time completing things on time, it is okay to ask about that. Just say, hey, I noticed that you're having trouble getting things in on time, or I noticed that you are missing a lot of classes. Do you need any additional supports? Is there something going on outside of class? Another easy way, if you're, really just don't want to get too much into it, I tell folks that you can include my office when you're just telling them about student services resources in general. Like, hey, you came to me and said you were struggling with X, Y, and Z. Well, here is the tutoring center. You can also talk to your counselor in student services. And then you can also talk to student accessibility services. And you can just present it as, I want you to be aware of these resources, and then the student can decide if that applies to them or not.
So I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. You would suggest that we maybe just ask more generally about things that they see as strengths or maybe challenges they've experienced, and then offer student services as a general array and mention student accessibility services. And just a note, I think that this is something we can do with all the class, like at the beginning of the semester. Of course, it's in the syllabus. It's part of our syllabus template. So we can remind students, if you've received accommodations in the past, like in a general speech, right? If you've received accommodations in the past, or maybe you had an IEP in high school and would like to receive accommodations here at Blue Ridge, we have our Student Accessibility Services office, our coordinator, Carolyn Levine, yada, yada. So we can promote it in a more general way without breaking any laws.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And you can even say that. You can say, I don't know if this would apply to you, but I want you to know that this is available. If you have, you might qualify for accommodations. And again, this may not apply to you, but just know that it's there. Sometimes a student might tell you that they had an IEP or a 504 in high school. Now, if they disclose that, then you can definitely say, okay, well, if you had an IEP and you want similar accommodations here, you need to register with Student Accessibility Services. Like I said, it really depends on the student, but if they disclose that information to you, then you're kind of off the hook as far as asking appropriate questions, if that makes sense. Because if they bring it up, then you're good.
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about is inclusive language. And I felt like this was really important to spend more time on the inclusive language because we are in a post-secondary environment. So we're going to talk about using person-first language, avoiding labels and stereotypes, not using condescending euphemisms, not portraying disability as an illness or a problem, and then using proper language in oral and informal speeches. So The information that I have here is from the UN Summit on Disability Inclusive Language Guidelines, and this was made by individuals with disabilities who have experienced these kinds of things. And so I feel really good about these guidelines being accurate and appropriate. So everyone has probably heard of person first language. This is emphasizing the person, not the disability. So, for example, we would say a person with a disability, not a disabled person, or children with autism instead of someone who is autistic, those kind of things. There are some exceptions though. So the deaf community is one. They often refer to themselves as deaf or deaf community with a capital D, and that's because they identify with the community that shares common language, culture, American Sign Language. This is similar to identity language, where someone prefers that over person first language because they feel pride in their disability. So someone who identifies as autistic might say, I'm autistic. And if that is how they refer to themselves, great. Please don't correct them and say, no, you're a person with autism, because obviously it's their choice and it's their identity. So just keep that in mind. Some people might not prefer person first language. I think this one is pretty self-explanatory though, avoiding labels and stereotypes. Everyone is disabled in some way. We all have our strengths and our limitations, and disability is just part of diversity in general. It's not something that needs to be dramatized or sensationalized. This is a pet peeve of mine, when people try to portray folks with disabilities as being inspirational or superhuman and say things like, oh, they're so courageous and brave, or they've overcome their disability. That's patronizing. Please don't do that. Avoid labeling people. Don't mention their disability unless it's 100% relevant. We want to focus on their skills and requirements and only point out their disability or impairment when it is required. So the example I have here is if you're discussing quality assessment for screen reader accessible documents, which we are all going to be doing a lot of in the near future. Let's say you're discussing this with your colleagues, you can mention that you have a student that's a screen reader user instead of saying, oh, I have a student that's blind that could help with this. The impairment isn't really relevant. What's relevant is, to this conversation anyway, is that they are a screen reader user, and that fact is what's relevant to the conversation, that they have that particular skill, not so much that they, or why they have that particular skill, if that makes sense. All right, number 3. Do not use condescending euphemisms. So over the years, there have been some expressions that have gained popularity as alternatives to inappropriate terms, things like differently abled or people of all abilities, disability with a capital A, people of determination. This sort of reflects the idea that disability needs to be softened, and it also can come off as patronizing and offensive. So using the phrase differently abled is problematic because a lot of advocates will say everyone is differently abled. So euphemisms a lot of times will come off as a denial of reality and a way to avoid talking about disabilities. Persons with disabilities is a more neutral term than differently abled. All right. We want to make sure we are not portraying disability as an illness or a problem. We should never be referring to people with disabilities as patients. We want to avoid using expressions like they suffer from, or they are afflicted with, or stricken with. We should not be using the term victim to describe someone with a disability. So you would never want to say that someone is a victim of cerebral palsy. That's, again, very condescending and inappropriate. We also want to avoid referring to a person inside a disability. So the example here is the man inside the paralyzed body, or beyond their disability, like she transcended her disability. We don't want to use those kind of terms. So using proper language in oral and informal speech. So most folks with disabilities are comfortable with, phrases that we use in daily life. Like you can say to someone in a wheelchair, let's go for a walk. Or you can say to someone who is deaf, have you heard the news? Now there's other phrases like blind as a bat, deaf as a post. You really shouldn't be using, even in an informal context. Also some metaphors like blind to criticism, or, fall on deaf ears, can be offensive. But I would say the biggest one is misusing terminology. So using disability related terms as an insult or to express criticism. And this is something that I myself even struggle with, and you probably hear students do this a lot, but saying things like, you know, oh, I forgot to do that, I must have Alzheimer's, or that person is so paranoid, when someone is acting with excessive mistrust. Or one I hear a lot is, oh, I'm so OCD. You know, we don't want to use disability terminology to describe a specific behavior or just a general feeling, because it's not the same thing. And then we're sort of taking away from the person who may have that diagnosis. All right. And then the last thing I have are just some resources that I think I've shared in previous presentations, but these are, of course, my page on the SharePoint website, the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, and then some disability specific websites, some accommodation websites, and just general disability information, including the ADA and Section 504 laws.
So Carolyn, with this such a great resource list, I'd love to be able to share the link to this Google slide deck in the YouTube link. So like when folks are watching the recording, it should be in the description underneath. Are you okay with that?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate y'all coming.
Well, we're really glad that you were able to be on the call with us, and we really appreciate everything again that you bring to the college. Your guidance and your support of our students is something that, you know, it really makes Blue Ridge an accepting and inclusive place for everyone. And our faculty, obviously, we know everybody wants to do the right thing, but it is a lot to know how to navigate, and sometimes it can be uncomfortable and tricky to know what to say or how to hold a professional standard while still making those appropriate accommodations. So thanks so much for everything that you do for the faculty and for our students here at the college. For those of you who are watching this, so I'm sorry, go ahead, Carolyn.
Y'all make my job easy, so I appreciate it.
Well, that's good to hear. For those of you who are watching the recording, please know you can always reach out to Carolyn Levine. She is the coordinator for Student Accessibility Services. Her office is in Sync in room 115. Is that right?
125.
Ah, see, 125. And you can always contact her by email as well. Thanks so much again, Carolyn, and we hope that you have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, Carolyn.